11 people walked into a canyon on a Tuesday afternoon and never walked out. One man survived. And somewhere in the hours before it happened, a warning existed. Whether anyone truly heard it is a question that has never been fully answered. August 12, 1997. Page, Arizona. The kind of afternoon that makes the American Southwest feel like a painting. Cloudless sky, the air carrying that dry mineral warmth that settles into your skin. A group of 12 descended into Lower Antelope Canyon. 7 French tourists, 2 Americans, a young British woman named Charlotte Warmington, a 22-year-old Swede named Anders Wasenius, and their Navajo guide. Some were seasoned travelers. Some were seeing the American West for the first time. All of them were there for the same reason. Because Antelope Canyon is extraordinary. Carved over millennia by wind and water into the Navajo sandstone, the walls twist and ripple like frozen smoke. In the afternoon light, shafts of gold pour down from narrow gaps in the ceiling 120 feet above. Photographers have called it the most beautiful slot canyon on Earth. That Tuesday, it looked exactly like the pictures. The canyon floor was dry, the sky above them was clear. But here's what none of them could see. Miles away, a thunderstorm was already emptying itself into the watershed that feeds directly into this canyon. Every drop of that rain had exactly one place to go. The walls in Lower Antelope Canyon are sometimes just a few feet apart. There's no climbing out, no shortcut to the surface. The only exits are the way you came in or the far end still ahead. The group moved deeper inside. And somewhere upstream, water was already moving. Those walls, the ones that look like frozen smoke, that glow amber and violet in the afternoon light, they didn't form that way by accident. Every curve, every polished hollow, every surface smooth enough to see your reflection in was carved by the same force that was moving toward this group right now. Antelope Canyon is what geologists call a slot canyon. Over thousands of years, flash floods carrying sand and silt at tremendous velocity cut down through Navajo sandstone, grinding the rock into these impossibly narrow corridors. The walls are smooth because water has done this before, millions of times. The canyon is, in the most literal sense, a scar left by flooding, a monument to every flood that came before this one. But here's the structural trap, and it's one that isn't obvious until someone explains it to you. The canyon doesn't flood because it rains there. It floods because it rains somewhere else. Lower Antelope Canyon sits at the bottom of a watershed spanning hundreds of square miles of high desert plateau. Rain falling on that plateau, invisible from the canyon floor, often miles away under a completely separate sky, has nowhere to go except down. The terrain funnels it. The sandstone doesn't absorb it, and all of that water, every drop, accelerates toward the lowest, narrowest point in the landscape, this canyon. When investigators recovered a camera from the 1997 flood, the images told a story that no eyewitness could have survived to describe. The footage showed an estimated 50 to 80 feet of water moving through the passage. 50 to 80 feet, in a corridor, sometimes only a few feet wide. That's a wall of water taller than a 5-story building, moving with the compressed force of everything the watershed had collected, squeezed into a space barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The canyon had done this before. The Navajo Nation knew it, tour operators knew it. The question isn't whether the danger was known, it's whether the people who walked in that Tuesday afternoon were ever truly told. At 2:12 p.m. on August 12, 1997, a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for the area surrounding Page, Arizona. It was extended again at 3:25 p.m. Those are documented facts. What happened between those timestamps and the moment 12 people descended into the canyon, that's where the story fractures into 3 separate versions, none of them fully reconcilable. The Navajo Nation's account is the most direct. Leaders stated that the toll booth operator at the canyon entrance warned the group to exit because of an upriver thunderstorm. Someone at some point said the words. The danger was communicated. That's the version in which the system functioned as intended. The tour company disputed it. And then there's Francisco Quintana's own account, the only person who was actually inside when the water came. His later recollections reportedly describe a group that entered without any effective warning reaching them. No one stopping them at the threshold, no clear signal that the calculus had changed. The county sheriff's investigation landed in the uncomfortable middle ground that tends to define these tragedies. A caution was given, the report concluded, but no formal order to leave was ever issued. Not a closure, not a command, a caution. The legal and moral distance between those two things turned out to be enormous. Think about what that actually means. A warning existed in the system. It was spoken or transmitted or implied. But a warning that doesn't reach the person who needs it in language they understand with enough authority to override a beautiful afternoon isn't really a warning at all. It's paperwork. It's someone's conscience covered. Some guides reportedly saw water beginning to trickle into the canyon entrance and cautioned hikers not to continue. Whether that caution reached this specific group in this specific moment remains contested. The canyon entrance was not formally closed. The group was not formally turned back. They went in. And here's the question that the sheriff's report couldn't answer, that no investigation since has fully resolved. When a warning exists but doesn't compel action, when it lives somewhere between a suggestion and an order, who carries the weight of what follows? Whether the warning was heard or not, the group was inside. And at some point after 3:25 p.m. on August 12, 1997, the canyon began to change. Francisco Quintana had been leading tours through Antelope Canyon long enough to know its moods. He knew how the light shifted in the afternoon. He knew where to position visitors for photographs. He knew the canyon the way you know a place you've walked through hundreds of times, its rhythms, its textures, its ordinary sounds. What he heard next was not ordinary. Before he saw anything, the canyon shook. That's the detail that surfaces in his later accounts, not the sight of water, not a wall of brown moving toward him, but sound and vibration arriving first. A deep, structural roar, the kind you feel in your chest before your brain registers it as danger. The walls themselves seem to move. In a passage sometimes only 3 or 4 feet wide, there's nowhere to look except up and forward. There was nothing coming from either direction. And then there was. The flood hit the group less than 100 yards into the canyon. They had barely started. Think about that distance. 100 yards, the length of a football field. They hadn't even reached the first bend. Quintana did what guides do in the seconds before everything becomes irreversible. He moved toward the people in his care. He found 2 tourists and pressed them against the sandstone wall, wedging his own body between them and the water, using his weight and the rock as a brace. It was the only physics available to him, his hands against their bodies, their backs against stone that had been polished smooth by 10,000 years of exactly this. The water did not negotiate. It rose past his grip, past the point where strength means anything, and it took them, both of them. And then it took him. What followed was something between survival and surrender. He went under repeatedly, blinded by the silt and mud that turned the water the color of concrete. The canyon offered no exits, no ledges to grab, no surface to break toward. He survived by doing the one thing panic makes almost impossible. He stayed calm. He floated on his back. He kept his feet pointed downstream, so the current carried him rather than crushed him against the walls. He was found downstream, bruised, temporarily blinded, the force of the water having stripped away most of his clothing. 11 others were not found alive. 2 were never found at all. Quintana survived. He would spend years trying to understand what that meant, eventually writing a memoir titled Breathe for Me, Surviving the Antelope Canyon Tragedy. But before we follow him into that aftermath, we need to understand who else was in that canyon and why they were there. 11 people, 7 French citizens, 2 Americans, a 24-year-old British woman named Charlotte Warmington from Warwick, England, a 22-year-old Swede named Anders Wasenius from Uddevalla, and Beatrice Aline, 20 years old from France, the first victim recovered found in a side tributary days after the flood. 2 victims were never recovered at all, somewhere in the drainage system downstream, In the landscape beyond the canyon's mouth, the water took them and did not give them back. Their families received a presumption instead of a certainty. There are people who never got to say goodbye over anything they could see. But the detail that lands hardest, the one that changes the weight of everything else, has nothing to do with the canyon itself. While the group was inside, two girls were waiting a motel room in Page, Arizona. An 8-year-old and a 13-year-old, both French, left behind while their parents went hiking. It was the kind of practical arrangement parents make a dozen times on a trip. You'll be fine, we'll be back by dinner, here's the television remote. An ordinary Tuesday afternoon in an ordinary motel room, somewhere between boredom and anticipation. Their parents did not come back. After the flood, the two girls were placed in Arizona state custody. They waited while search teams worked. They were in a foreign country, in a room that smelled like someone else's life. And they did not speak the language of the people who eventually came to explain what had happened. Think about what that explanation even sounded like. 11 people made a choice to enter a canyon on a beautiful afternoon. They left behind jobs, plans, return flights, people who loved them. And 2 of them left behind children who are still out there somewhere, grown now, carrying something that never fully becomes the past. That's what 11 deaths actually means, not a statistic, a Tuesday that never ended. And this was not an isolated afternoon. August 12, 1997 was deep inside the North American monsoon season. That stretched from July through September, when convective thunderstorms build over the Colorado Plateau almost daily, dumping enormous volumes of rain into drainage systems that feed directly into canyon floors miles away. The sky above your head can be clear. The storm that kills you is somewhere else entirely. And in that single week in August, Antelope Canyon was not the only canyon in Arizona that flooded. It was the 4th disastrous flood in the state within 7 days. 4 events, 1 week, the same monsoon system, the same physics, the same structural hazard, playing out repeatedly across the same landscape while people kept walking in. Here's the number that reframes everything. Since 1961, 15 people have died in Glen Canyon National Recreation Area from canyon floods. 15 deaths across 36 years of recorded history. 11 of them happened in a single afternoon. That's not a freak event. That's a pattern with a catastrophic spike. And the spike happened precisely where the warnings were softest, the access most informal, and the response most dependent on a verbal caution at a ticket booth. Some commercial operators in the region reported that certain slot canyons flood approximately once every couple of years. Others noted that floods can occur multiple times within a single season. The canyon was never an anomaly. The only real question was when and who would be inside. 1 year later, in 1998, rangers at Zion National Park faced almost the identical situation at the Narrows. They issued an early, decisive warning and physically kept hikers out. 2 people still died. But dozens who would have been inside that day were not. Early action works. The system is capable of it. What's your honest reaction when you hear that the tools existed and the 1997 group still went in? Drop your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious whether you would have turned back that afternoon. And if this kind of story is new to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. We cover disasters, survival, and the systems that fail the people inside them. The system knew how to protect people. It just didn't always choose to. So what happened after 11 people died? Someone had to answer for it. Except almost no one did. The investigation moved quickly, and then it stopped. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence, reviewed the disputed warnings, reviewed the chain of decisions that led 12 people into a canyon during an active monsoon week, and they concluded there was no clear legal basis for criminal prosecution. No single party directly at fault, no individual whose choices under existing law rose to the level of criminal negligence. One person was cited. Ella Young, a Navajo guide, was found to have violated tribal regulations, specifically for not remaining with tourists after allowing them into the canyon. That was the accountability the system produced. A regulatory citation. Not a courtroom, not a sentence, not a verdict. For the families of 11 people, that answer had to land like a second loss. Here's what makes it complicated, though, and this is where the story resists the simple version. The investigators weren't wrong that no single person caused this. That's precisely the problem. The failure was distributed. It lived in the gap between a verbal caution and a formal closure. It lived in the assumption that a beautiful sky meant a safe canyon. It lived in permit language that allowed entry until flooding was deemed imminent, a word that, in a slot canyon, means you're already out of time. The Navajo Nation responded with what it could control: new warning signs, fines for violations, tougher enforcement, a safety philosophy explicitly described as preventive rather than reactive, meaningful changes, real ones. But reforms are not the same as justice, and the families who flew home from Arizona that August knew the difference. The timing problem didn't go away either. In 2003, a canyoneering group entered Keyhole Canyon at Zion National Park after rangers warned that flash flooding was probable. By the time a formal warning was issued, the group was already inside, unreachable. The word probable had not been enough to stop them. The canyon did not wait for certainty. Same gap, different canyon, different year, same outcome. If you've been following this story and you're asking yourself who should have been held responsible, I want to hear your answer. Seriously, leave it in the comments. Because the legal system gave one response, and I suspect a lot of you have a different one. And if this video has been worth your time, hitting like helps more people find it. These are the stories that deserve a wider audience. Francisco Quintana walked out of Antelope Canyon with 11 people he couldn't save. That's not a metaphor. That's what he carries. Every interview, every school visit, every page of the memoir he eventually wrote, Breathe for Me, Surviving the Antelope Canyon Tragedy, is built around that weight. The title isn't triumphant, it's an obligation. He breathes for 11 people who can't. That's the frame he chose for his survival, and it's the most honest accounting of what it means to be the one who lived. He didn't survive because he was lucky. He survived because he stayed calm when panic would have killed him, because he knew the physics of moving water, because decades of guiding had given him a body that knew what to do when his mind couldn't catch up. That's skill. That's experience. And it still wasn't enough to save anyone else. That's the part that doesn't resolve. Now step back from the canyon floor for a moment, because the real story was never happening there. The canyon floor was dry, the sky above the slot was clear, the beauty was completely real, and none of it was the relevant information. The relevant information was miles away in a watershed neither the tourists nor most of the guides were watching, where a thunderstorm was already converting itself into a wall of water with one destination. The warning that existed that afternoon, verbal, uncertain, disputed, was a suggestion dressed up as a safeguard. And a suggestion is not a closed gate. That's the answer the 11 deaths purchased. Not a legal verdict, not a single person held responsible. Just this: a warning only works if it's impossible to walk past. Not a caution at a ticket booth, not language about flooding being probable. A physical barrier, a locked entrance. A system that doesn't depend on whether a tourist understood the words or whether a guide felt empowered to turn a group around on a beautiful afternoon. The canyon was never the danger, the watershed was. And the gap between knowing that and building a system that acts on it, that gap is where 11 people disappeared. Quintana is still out there, still telling this story because someone has to. And here's the final thing worth sitting with: the canyon is still open. Antelope Canyon receives roughly 100,000 visitors every year now, making it one of the most visited slot canyons on Earth. The Navajo Nation implemented mandatory guided tours, weather monitoring stations, and radio communication systems that didn't exist in 1997. Guides today carry weather radios and are required to evacuate immediately at the first sign of upstream activity. The entrance gates are physical, lockable, and closed by decision rather than suggestion. Those are real structural changes, the kind that cost something to build and require ongoing commitment to maintain. In the 27 years since 1997, there has not been another mass casualty flood event inside Antelope Canyon. that matters. It means the lesson was actually learned, not just acknowledged, not just memorialized, but engineered into the system. The gap that killed 11 people was closed with metal and protocol and authority, not just words. That's what it looks like when a tragedy produces something other than grief. The question that opened this story, whether the warning was truly heard, never got a clean answer. But the answer that came after, the one built into the canyon's infrastructure, is the clearest possible statement that a verbal caution was never enough. It took 11 deaths to prove it. It should not have taken that many.